welcome to people that are watching the recording in the future. Here I am with Molly Parker, who's just introduced us to the world of voice and accent coaching, which is what she does. And I'm going to dive straight into, actually, I would love you to share one thing that you wish actors knew about their voices, or about, like, you know, things they could be working on, like maybe some of the misconceptions that you see come up a lot. Because as a Shakespeare specialist, I see a lot of misconceptions about what it is we're actually doing here. So you might come up a lot against that kind of thing too, I'd imagine.
Totally. And it's a really good question, because there are a few things that obviously spring to mind. One thing is the idea that voice work or going into a voice lesson is about changing your voice or fixing your voice or ironing out any issues in your voice. And I can't speak for the whole of the voice coaching industry, but I can say that for my practice, at least, that's a really unhelpful way of viewing voice work, because it's not so much that we're fixing anything. It's actually that we're exploring what you already have. There's a really nice expression that a few colleagues around me always use, which is, I'm always going to go off of what I can hear, not what I can't hear. And so I think bringing that into voice work is really important, because a lot of students kind of prep themselves for, I need to sound like this, I need to have this accent when I'm doing this, and I need to make sure that this issue is solved. And actually, there's nothing that needs fixing, because you're alive, your breathing's great, you're able to communicate day to day. What we try to do is kind of open up your options, just like if you were learning to play the saxophone for the first time. You're never going to go in to a saxophone lesson and say, there's something wrong with my saxophone, please fix it. You're going to go into a saxophone lesson and say, hey, can you teach me how to do these scales? And that's exactly what a voice lesson is. Whereas I think people, for some reason, presume there's something wrong with them, and that's the energy that they tend to bring in. And that's not what we do.
I love that. And I feel like there's probably some similarities with Shakespeare, that I do a lot of work with people on breaking through fear, because we're often carrying all these kind of assumptions. I call it sometimes people pleasing through time, where either, you know, you watched a movie one time and you think, oh, I'm supposed to do it like that, or you had an English teacher that told you blah, blah. And I feel like it's the same with voice. Like we get these ideas in our head. I know when I was younger, I got told my voice was too high. So then I was, okay, I have to make it low. I was pushing down into my lowest, and so uncomfortable and not safe and all these things. But I felt so ashamed of, you know, that I'd been, you know, that there was something wrong with my voice, and that I had to change it in order to actually get work as an actor. So many things.
Yeah, it's always about opening up that. And I'd say that's a really common one, especially I think with Shakespeare, is people will tell you, you have to go into this very kind of like English RP, low voice, and which is ridiculous. Shakespeare was never even spoken in an RP accent, first of all. And secondly, like anytime you feel like you're pigeonholing or like, you know, putting your little voice in a keyhole, and it has to only exist here, that's never going to be a good sign. And maybe if you're being told it sits in a higher register, that you can explore those lower tones, but it's not to say that you then have to completely shift. It's feedback is everything. How you take it, how it's told, it's really has a massive impact.
I love that. And I feel like, and that's, yeah, everything you're saying, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so many similarities, because I often describe to people that that's been my journey of realizing, oh, in thinking that I had to do one thing, I shut out another. And it actually is made my performance more two-dimensional. And part of that was my voice. My voice has been, for me, a long journey of learning to love it and still look after it. And I'm learning all the time, which is possibly why, you know, I watch all your reels and everything on TikTok as well, just to be like, ideas, because it's so personal, I suppose. You know, the difference with the saxophone is that the saxophone is outside yourself, and with the voice, it's like, oh no, it's me, you know, and it feels so personal. So do you find with your students or in your classes, do you find that you have to kind of, you know, mother them a little, or nurture them a lot through that? Is it part of what you do?
Totally. I think to explore your voice, or just to explore even just, you know, sharing in a space, it's always going to be super vulnerable. And the voice especially is so tied to identity. It's how we perform, is, you know, our voice is a huge part of that. And again, I think we're coming into generations of people who maybe weren't led in voice practices or in Shakespeare classes or in acting classes in maybe the safest way. And I think we're coming into a world anyway, from where I am in London, where a lot of that is drastically changing. We don't have any sort of prefaces over you must do Shakespeare. Where I work anyway, we don't say Shakespeare must be done in this way or your voice must be this way. It's totally changing the narrative, which is really healthy and really surprising, because people are actually being like, oh wait, I can just come in as me and you'll bring out the best part of me. So yeah, it takes for sure a lot of nurturing, for sure a lot of, you know, facilitating that space and that safe space that hopefully you're in.
And, you know, if we could turn this into a tiny step that someone could do for themselves, you know, if there's someone listening that's like, oh, I feel like that, do you have any sort of practical thoughts on the first step they could take to kind of nurture themselves through this process if they feel like that sort of thing is coming up for them?
That's a really good question. And I think what might be helpful for someone if they're going through that is, I always talk about the kind of like double A start to the work. Double A meaning you have awareness and then you have appreciation. And most of the time, people are really good at growing awareness of what their bad habits might be. Like, bad being that's what they're telling themselves in their head, that it's bad. That could be as simple as, I know it's a bad habit that I crane my neck forward when I speak, or I know it's a bad habit that I am holding my breath. And they've been told that, which is in a way good technical knowledge, good anatomical knowledge. Yes, you're going to be sending your body into a place that might not be the healthiest or might not be the most efficient for voicing. And that awareness is a great thing. However, what tends to go is awareness into judgment, not awareness into appreciation, which is my second A. And you have to start to learn, how can I appreciate the fact that my body has this habit? Because your body's just always working so hard to protect you in every sense of the word. And a lot of people will find that their breath, for example, might sit quite shallowly. And a lot of people will be told that's not very good or that's not very efficient. And while they're not wrong for being told that, you then shouldn't allow yourself to go into, oh, that's bad, I'm going to chastise myself for holding my breath like that. Actually, you're probably breathing in that way because that's a really efficient way of your body just breathing, which is great because it keeps you alive. And also it might be that, yes, your body's going into this fight or flight state quite often, but isn't that amazing that your body's trying to protect you in that moment? And how fantastic that is, that that's your habit and your body's actually working with you, even though it doesn't need to in that moment. Your body doesn't have a filter when you're nervous to go on stage versus when you're literally, you know, fighting for your life. Your body doesn't sense the two. And so I think it's vital that when you're doing any sort of body work, any sort of voice work, you're having to, yes, keep that awareness, but start to appreciate the habits that your body has. And then we can look at the application of new ways. So then it comes into, oh, okay, I've noticed I'm holding my breath here. Thank you, firstly, my body, for thinking I need that, I'm actually going to second guess that and say, I don't need that right now. And I want to explore what happens if I don't do that. And then you go into the work or the next step from there, rather than, yeah, I'm getting really frustrated because I'm holding my breath. Or a good way of putting it is always being curious about the habits that you have, not beating yourself up for it.
I love this. I feel like there's so much that goes into, I personally just keep coming back to the nervous system. You know, as a performer, it's, for me, everything comes back to the breath and the nervous system, and, you know, talking yourself through it, but also finding those practices that will allow you to look after yourself physically, to get through these, because it's not enough to just sort of be nice to yourself. I find you need to take that next step of like, well, what do I need in order to allow myself to take a deeper breath? I may never have done that in my whole life. What am I going to need to do in order to calm my system enough to say I am safe to take a deep breath? And that, you know, it makes me think of, I know you've recently gone into breath work, and you mentioned you're a breath work practitioner. I'd love to hear about how you went on that journey to realize, oh, this is a great next step for me, and what that has meant for your practice.
Totally. I mean, it came about because I was leading actors and people through breath work, or through the voice lens of breath work, which you know, and I was noticing how much emotion was coming up for a lot of people, and how much emotional availability. And so I actually got to a point where I was like, oh, you know, if it's bringing up this much, which I understand on a personal level because I've been there, I just want to make sure that I know as much as I can, or I take next steps in knowing just exactly what's happening here. So it's developed my practice in the sense of, actually, I'm able to self-regulate myself better in order to be a better facilitator and coach at a room. So yes, it's influenced the voice practice in terms of I have a greater understanding of breath. I have a greater sense, I think, of someone's breathing patterns, why that might be the case, a greater scientific and anatomical knowledge of what that means. But more than anything, I think, and you might be similar, and I think there's something massive in the actor's craft beyond like educational institutionalism here as well, is that you get to a point in your learning where you realize, yes, you're learning to teach, but really you're also learning to become a better teacher because you're embodying more of the work. And I think that's what I found with breath work. It was a very much started as, oh, I'm noticing, I'm holding space for someone who's coming up with a lot of emotions when we're dropping into breath. I should know more about this. And then I was like, oh no, like I should know more about this. Like I need this work. And then I started bringing that into the room, and just that self-regulation of my own breath and doing the work myself, I have noticed has had a massive impact on the actors and the clients that I work with, because, you know, we're all just felt energies in one space communicating with one another. And so that's mainly the biggest impact it's had. And it's the root, as I agree with you, your nervous system, your breath work, it's really the root of so much we do, that yet it's something that we don't tend to practice. Like, you know, not in the Western sort of culture anyway, we don't practice breathing. And so it's had a huge impact on me and my practice. Yeah.
I think this is some of the stuff that I feel like if I could talk to my younger self, I would be like, learn more about these somatic practices, learn more about your breath, and that your breath will transform your acting, because it's what everything comes back to is you know, breath is acting. For me, that's kind of ultimately, and that's part of the reason. I mean, I could go off on the whole thing, but you know, with Shakespeare, I consider Shakespeare's rhythms breath work of a sort, you know, that he's actually guiding us through breath. So I'm fascinated with the breath. The journey that it goes on is very similar to singing. So there's the kind of things that I would say to my younger self, and now do say to my students, to be like, learn to make friends with your breath. I'd love to hear, you know, are there things that you would like to say to or, you know, that you see as maybe a pattern across particularly younger actors, because I work with a lot of young people and people that are maybe trying out for drama schools and that kind of thing. Do you notice, apart from this tendency to judge, are there things that they could be adjusting that they're not aware of? Often it's an awareness thing, I think, that people go, you could be just tweaking your technique just this much and it would open up a whole world for you.
Yes. I'd say breath being one of them. Totally agree, and love that analogy of Shakespeare being like breath work in phrases. I think noticing how I'll use the phrase, allow the breath to drop in rather than taking a breath before a line. See what happens if you just allow your body to experience an inhale rather than you feeling like you need to prepare, you need to get the body ready for the line. See what happens if you just allow the breath in. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, honestly, is kind of going from that idea of releasing the diaphragm and releasing this breath and allowing it all to happen, is jaw release. I think that's probably the second most common thing I notice in younger actors. I think especially since we're all still recovering from wearing masks, a lot of us still probably are wearing masks when we're out and about, and there's a lot of tension here, and that tension is going to tell your body, I'm in danger. That danger is going to mean that your breath stops and the cycle will start again. So we're trying to find as much release in the jaw as possible. And there are lots of exercises you can do here. Some of my favorites involve not actually touching the jaw too much, but instead maybe imagine that there are dangly earrings right at the back of your jaw, because your jaw muscles run along here. And just maybe imagining the earrings are dropping the jaw now and then, or maybe you go from that jaw drop and you allow your tongue to release, and you just speak some lines like this and you see how that feels. And those are both exercises from Annie Morrison, who has a fantastic book on creative articulation, which is all about trying to not fix, but trying to kind of allow space. But I think I would tell Molly to focus on those two areas, younger Molly, as well as most of my actors, to start there, because it's somewhere where you'll notice day to day, oh, wow, like I'm really holding more than I thought. It's a really common place for people to hold that tension.
I find I get a lot of tongue tension as well. I'm chronic for jaw tension, tongue tension. I suppose for me, I do a lot of tongue release stuff. I think my jaw then follows suit. My jaw goes, okay. With the tongues loosening up, the jaw can chill now as well. But also,
it kind of ties together.
Yeah, you know, and I think that's one of the things that, I mean, I certainly am one of those people that can get on the, like, being hard on myself, beating myself up about patterns and that kind of thing. And I notice, you know, that my neck will be tense, and then I'll get all this tension in my jaw. I used to have a lot of trouble with jaw tension, and over the last few years I've realized that if I release my hip flexors or my hamstrings, my calf muscles, well, actually if I release my lower body, the upper body is like, I wish I'd known, like,
you know, sometimes if you have like a problem area, not seeing it as the problem area, is that like, don't give it attention, and it's like, oh, I can breathe, I can expand, and I'm okay now.
I mean, you know, it's so tricky, isn't it? Because it takes, for me, you know, I'm nearly 40, and it's taken me a long time of learning about my body, such a long time. And I suppose when I was younger, I just kind of wanted to know everything straight away. But you know, you mentioned, was it Annie Morrison, the book that you mentioned? Is that right? And do you tend to recommend, in terms of for people that maybe are not in training right now, maybe they want to go into training, or maybe they're independent artists, semi-professional artists, if they're wanting to do some kind of vocal training, are there things that you recommend that they do? You know, books can sometimes be, I find some books are so dense that it, you know, that it's like, oh, like I looked at some Linklater ones and I was like, I can see what you're going for here, but it was like, what is happening here?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think, well, in terms of what I think is one of my favorite voice texts, if you do want to learn from a book, is Barbara Hausman's texts. I think are really accessible. She has one just on voice and one on text, and I think it's literally like with diagrams on what you can do. Otherwise, don't underestimate what you do for the body is what you're going to do for your voice. So just like you said, taking time every single day to do a little bit of mobility work of stretching a hamstring and just actively trying to allow the breath in and out as you do so. What I would then add to that, right? So let's say you are like, okay, I'm going to do a mobility exercise that I learned in PE or the gym, or I see other people do. Start to allow breath in and out, but then try to see what happens if you start exhaling on a fricative. So a fricative is like a consonant sound where there's a tiny gap between the articulators. So like an S, a shushing sound, a Z or a Z, and just see what happens if you, with that stretch, allow the breath in, and then hold on to that fricative. And then I'd be really interested to see in your favorite stretch, so like child's pose or while doing cat-cow, a lot of the work stems from yogic practices. So I'd really suggest using that as your base. See what happens if you go from that fricative into lines of text. So if a line was to be or not to be, maybe you're to be or not to be, and it's just that you're replacing that fricative with the text. That's something that I think would be a really good warm-up and something I use every other day, and I'm constantly teaching through that lens.
I'm happy to hear you say these things because I feel like I'm doing a lot of this in my own practice. I'm always really excited to expand my practice. Like I'm always trying to find new things to do it. But this is what I've often come back to lately is that for me, free and playful movement, usually on my yoga mat, moving the body jet like cat and cow with movement and a little bit of sound, opening, going from a fricative or any sort of continuous sound into then opening into an open vowel, like and then into lines of text, like pretty much exactly what you said. I found that it's kind of the simple things that work in the end. And I taught a class today with my my membership where we do weekly classes, and we were looking at some of this stuff, and I was sharing about how I keep coming back to with the breath and this idea of connecting to a text, but a lot of the time it's just about syncing up your breath and your sound, that your body, once you sort of allow, okay, my breath is my body, that I can sync this up just by breathing and speaking. I breathe, I speak and move, so I'm just allowing those things to naturally sync up in a really gentle way can do a lot. Like small things can do a lot, intuitive things can do a lot.
Totally. I really think, again, similarly, I'm always curious about doing more. And this year, actually, I'm really trying to think, actually, if I had 5 things and I just dove into those 5 things, I think I'd find a lot more satisfaction than where I'm trying to keep thinking about. It's so easy to think about the next best thing, and actually I always come down to that tool belt of 3 to 5 things that, and it's also more sustainable as a practice to keep it to that as well, and then allow things to influence and draw on, but just keep coming back to that foundational thing.
I think I, as a younger actor, used to feel like I needed to be doing, and even because I've taught in choirs and that kind of thing, my background is in music, and so I always felt like with warm-ups, it needed to be a lot and it needed to be vigorous, and that I've realized over time that sometimes 10 minutes is plenty if I'm doing it regularly. Sometimes 6 minutes is enough, and that actually, and even coming back to, even if I don't do anything with sound, even if I were to just come back to my breath, that could sometimes be enough to kind of tap into the right kind of things, just to release. So I'm producing a healthy sound. Less is more, all these things that we learn over time. And before we sort of go on, I'll just say, if the people that are watching live, if you have any questions for Molly, or for me, but you know, Molly's our special guest. So if you have questions, just drop them in the comments in the Facebook group, and I'll just keep an eye out. But I have a couple more things that I wanted to ask Molly about, and one of them is about classical acting. And do you think that there's something that in particular that's, I know you said before that the landscape has changed, right, in terms of what we need. But I do think that classical acting requires a lot of us in terms of our vocal technique. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, because you're two-folded is kind of coming back to this idea of you're having to take ownership of language that you may not be familiar with and you may not use day to day, which is hard. Again, I think breath is the routine and finding release and exactly what you've been saying about, but finding that ownership of that language, allowing yourself to, and this goes on to the kind of second thing, is I talk a lot about the idea of, and I'm sure you maybe do something similar, of experiencing that language rather than like reading that language. And it's this thing that I have a massive battle with constantly, to intellectualize it versus to viscerally experience it. And that's why so much of the work is somatic and is body focused for me, because I have such a fear still over Shakespeare. I think I will always have some sort of fear, like I really will. And so once I understand it, it can feel like, great, I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm going to go out and I'm going to speak it through, but then I haven't taken any sort of ownership or any sort of experience of the language. And when I notice actors allowing themselves to enjoy what classical text can bring out in their voice, like music, like poetry, and really enjoy the sensation of what it is to land, and then connect to, if it's a duologue, but what do I actually just want to say? What am I going into it? Then it seems like this really beautiful balance of, okay, you've experienced the words from your body. I don't feel like you're putting on a voice to speak it through. And then it feels like you've got that energy in the scene between what are you trying to communicate then? So taking ownership, experiencing, and then coming back to the idea of, but what do I want you? Like what the attention isn't to sit here, it's to allow that to flow through and to hit you.
Yeah, I love this. And I actually think, you know, this is why I'm so gung-ho about teaching Shakespeare, because I think sometimes people misunderstand, you know, what the point is of learning Shakespeare, in my opinion, is to strengthen some of our key technical areas. And for me, that's one of them, that Shakespeare forces us to really get out of our heads and get back to, this is about you, the energy is coming to you. And that can be such a tricky thing, especially when you are working with all these layers of, I don't know what this means, I don't speak like this normally, how loud do I need to be, where is the person, and oh my goodness, I'm in the round and I need to act with my back, and all those kind of things. If we can manage all of that and still throw it out at the other, you know, be energetically present with the other person, there's such a gift to learning that skill. And are you someone that likes a bit of Patsy Rodenberg, and are you a fan and her? I think it was her that I think she has a book about Second Circle.
Yeah, I love Patsy's work on it. I think it's in her book on presence, or it's called Circles, but the circle exercise of that inner, outer, middle, I use that with everyone, and it's a really really useful tool. It's like that stepping stone. And for me, it reads as, and she might even say it in her text, but as that fight flight response again, and coming back to the nervous system. When you allow your nervous system to settle in that circle, then it's almost, I'm a massive fan of the circles. I think it's a really great practice.
Could you can you give us a quick rundown for the people that are not familiar? Can you give us the short version, or do you feel like it's too complex to?
Of course I can, but I'm also aware that if you wanted to know Patsy's original, definitely read it, because I'm probably very much changed it so much. I've taught
Well,
version
tell
at
us
this
your
point.
version. Yeah.
But what I'll often get actors to do when they first start is we embody two different types of people. Person A, you can think of as the class clown. They are the person who is always the loudest in the room, takes up the most presence. However, they might not be the best at observing other things, right? They might not notice the colors of the wall. They might not pick up on those cues that maybe that joke isn't that funny and that person doesn't want to talk, or they might interrupt people, and not because they're trying to be mean. It's just, you know, part of their nature. We notice how our breath is, how our body is in that state. Then we kind of go to another end of the spectrum somewhere, in which case someone is actually a lot more comfortable camouflaging in, and there's someone who would much rather, you know, listen and then maybe respond if the timing feels like important for them to do so. They'll often know the answer to a question but rarely put their hand up. And they're often the person that person A interrupts, actually is tends to be that state or that energy. It's a little bit more closed usually in the body. And both of those examples are the inward circle and the outward circle, which I believe Patsy calls circles 3 and 1. And for me, person A is kind of that fight, bulldozy response to things, and that B person is kind of that inward circle, is more of a flight response to things. I don't really want to be here. And so one way I try to coach people into that neutral ground, or what it is to be present in that space and in that second circle that Patsy calls it, is we go to the senses a lot. So if your body's reacting to this environment as a fight flight response, it makes sense to me why we shouldn't then use the body's senses or the body's language to remind us of, oh, wait, I'm not fighting for my life. I'm just on a stage. I'm in a space. I'm with peers. And so we walk around the space thinking, what can I feel? What can I hear? What can I see? And you're just literally listing those things, which I know is a brilliant thing to do when we're nervous for monologues as well. And we're listing those things and we're really trying to be curious about it. So it's not just what can you feel under your feet? It's how does the floor feel today? You know, is it smooth? Is it hard? Is it cold? Is it warm? What would your footprints look like if you're walking on sand and you were leaving footprints? And it's just being as curious about the visceral aspects as possible. The ones that feel good anyway. Obviously, if you've got like a itchy scarf on, you might not want to focus on that. But that's what the presence exercise is in my books. But Patsy, I'm sure I've adjusted that slightly.
No, I love that. And it actually makes me miss classes. It makes me miss drama school. And I know that you've taught in drama schools, and I know that we'll have people in the group that are in the midst of that process. Do you have any insights in terms of actors maybe who are wanting to get into the schools? Is anything vocally or even just generally that you would share with us that you think, okay, this is a good thing to keep in mind? I have so many thoughts on this subject because it's such a big topic. But in terms of do you think that there's something that that the schools are looking for vocally, or that shows, maybe part of that readiness to train that pops up in their voice, in their auditions?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. And the first thing I would say is when you have a voice coach on the panel, I think a huge part of it is honestly the voice coach or voice tutor being there to ensure they can't. I've been on panels before with auditions where I'm simply there to notice if there's anything that I'm hearing that might be more of a disorder or might be something that's to raise concern. So that's the first thing I will say, is the voice coach isn't always there to be like, that voice is good, that voice is bad. It's more so if the rest of my colleagues have really loved that performance, they might check with me to say, is this something that you want to flag? In which case I'll say yes or no. And even if I'm flagging it, that's nowhere near saying, well, you're not ready for drama school. It's simply to go in their notes to make sure that if you do come and you are accepted, it's something that's already been flagged and we can help you out straight off the bat. So that's the first thing I will say. If you're introduced to a voice coach in the room, don't let it then stress you out about your voice. So we genuinely might be there from a health and safety point of view. Second thing is, when I am in the room and invited into those spaces, I think having vocal energy to the end of the line is really essential, especially when it comes to both of your monologues, all of the monologues. Vocal energy, staying on voice, which is going to, for me, come back to, if you're on thought, you're on voice. So again, trusting the idea that if I know what I'm saying, I know who I'm speaking to, I know what the impulse to speak is, then trust your voice is there. And then the second thing is allowing exploration in the pitches. So trying to not come in and feel like I'm having to fit in this pigeonhole of what so-and-so has said, and I should sound like this because my character sounds like this. And we really want to hear your voice. Like, even though it's maybe a more vocally energized voice, maybe it's a voice that you feel like you've had to explore before coming into the space, we want to make sure it's yours, not what you think we should hear. Because you can tell when you're putting on versus when you're experiencing and owning that text. So those are the things I would say usually for a panel.
That's amazing. I think yeah, I mean, like, yes, absolutely. I second all of that. I think the vocal energy thing is a big thing that I spot coming up a lot with students, is that there's this focus on they want to be so truthful, you know, that and grounded, that there's kind of everything's it's like way too relaxed, like to the point that it's not helpful relaxation. It's like unsupported, where
collapse. Right?
Collapsed is a good way to put it. That and I see it in the body, because I kind of look holistically with this stuff, but I see it in their bodies as well, that they can be physically collapsed. But you know, giveaways are sometimes the flappy arm, that that they're just not quite there. And I mean, for you, do you have ways that if a student, if an actor's working towards these things, whether it's for drama school or something else, and they're catching themselves and feeling like, I feel collapsed, or I don't think I'm achieving that kind of vocal energy that maybe I've received some feedback about, are there ways that they can start to cultivate, or just even stepping into normalizing it for themselves? Because I think part of the problem that I see is that it's become normal to have like zero energy going through the body and voice, because of the, we're all on Zoom and we're all, thinking in camera. How do we get into the
totally? And I smile at what you said, because, oh my God, my right arm loves to get involved, and it's always going to be involved. And that's like my biggest telltale as well. So I totally relate to that. For me, physicalizing on the regard. So I like to use things like love and efforts, where I will think about pushing all the way through, or I'll flick this line away. And it's not that a flick is losing that vocal energy. It's just that I'm being intentional about every line, and I'm going to physicalize it. And so if my line was Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, it's going to feel really weird. I'm going to imagine I'm pressing something really hard as I say that line. But then when I take it away, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, suddenly it feels like I'm pressing without having to actively do anything. And it's just making sure that I'm physically engaging in that exercise until my thought is finished. And then I reset and I go again, versus what tends to happen is we go Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. And what happens to the thing you're pressing? It's just gone. So it's just making sure that the exercise I would do to get into that is picking an action, picking an effort that's going to take you all the way to the end line, and then allowing it to drop at the end. Similarly, there's an exercise where you can get something fairly heavy or fairly lightweight, and you can pick it up as you say the first word of the line and place it down once you've finished the thought. So the collapse may happen, but only after your thought has finished, not midway. Because you're right, a lot of people, I think, are just trying to say it, and that's great. But if you haven't gone through the training that's needed in order to make sure you're kind of vocally engaged, you'll just say it, then you're kind of restricting yourself. You're not, or you're finding collapse and you're finding restriction, it's just this gentle balance that's so hard, I think, to get right, especially when you're new and you're younger and you're trying to get into drama school, because yes, we're asking you to show us you, and you are not yet a trained actor. So it's just giving yourself forgiveness as well for that. And yeah, I would go through the body, as many games as you can, like picking up a bag or pressing through or flicking through is going to be, I think, a really healthy way in.
I love this. I'm like, I do all the same things. Well, you know, variations, but yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing I found really interesting is because I work with students primarily in the US and the UK, that there's this complete divide that I noticed, particularly with the UK, this kind of through the body way of working, the text, you know, rigorous text work is a part of what they do. And then in the US, it's the psychology. And for people that I work with in the US, kind of going, okay, we're going to just literally pick a thing up, or we're going to push. And it can be sometimes like, oh, if they have some theatre experience, they might be fine with that. But if they haven't really had training, if they're actually looking to go into training, it can be really quite a bizarre thing, because they're coming from, you know, everything that I need to do needs to be psychology, but that actually keeps them very stuck in their heads and out of their bodies, and it doesn't have the result that they want. So it's such an interesting,
very interesting.
I mean, and that makes me think, so, you know, there is this kind of interesting divide in the US and the UK, but I also wanted to ask you about people that work across stage and screen. And I find that people that are very focused, actors who tend to be very focused on screen work, particularly emerging actors, I find that there's this sometimes a bit of a cavalier attitude about their voice work and their voice practice, because I think they go, well, I don't need it because there's a mic above my head or whatever. And personally, I think that doesn't really help anybody, because you can really easily get into some unhealthy habits that you might not realize you have, or you might not have flexibility, you might not have it there when you need it. Do you have any thoughts on that? You know, what the role of voice work is in screen work, for example?
Yeah, Jeanette Nelson, who is the resident voice coach at the National for a while, said something that I love, which is, you know, the microphone only picks up what you put in. So when we're thinking about something like energizing, if you're collapsing, the microphone's just going to pick up that collapse. If you're like exploring one part of your range, the microphone only picks up that one part of your range and amplifies exactly that. There's so much more to voice work than projection and healthy projection. Yes, that's a huge part, but the microphone is simply amplifying what you are vocally engaging with. And so for me, they're both totally important. And yes, theatre is going to, you know, just with the nature of what it is to be in live theatre, your voice is going to have a little bit more time, I think. And literally in the industry, I would be given far more time in theatre and expected to be way more involved in theatre than it would be on set. But the microphone is not a crutch. It's literally amplifying exactly what you would be doing. Yeah, that's the best thing I would have for that. To me, it just, as you said, it goes into both, because the microphone is not some magical thing that's going to make your voice sound amazing. It's not auto-tune. It's just going to...
I feel like if you're ever doing voiceover work, you learn that pretty quickly, because as soon as you hear yourself back, you're like, whoa, because it's just amplifying everything that's there. So for me, it was like, well, you know, let's look at what I'm actually doing here, because as soon as you're up close, if there's a problem, it's actually going to be a million times worse And I think,
Yeah.
you know, I'm very focused on the sort of the longevity and that kind of thing as well, is about safe practices, and that I've seen a lot of people on sets that are, you know, maybe it's a horror movie and they're screaming, or like I remember a scene where someone was giving birth, you know, and it's like that, but this actor had no idea how to take care of her own voice. Or scenes where people are crying, screaming at each other, you know, like there's so much stuff that's actually, it's quite intense work sometimes, and it's just a slightly different structure of intensity, I think, from screen to stage, where, you know, stage we're kind of doing it every night, but with screen it might be you're doing it for 8 hours in, you know, in a row, or whatever, you know, like it's those kinds of things, and you're exhausted and you're at, you know, physically at your weakest, for example.
Yeah.
There's so many things that we need to have in place to support us.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts on like vocal practice for actors who want to get a little, you know, that are looking after their vocal health? Do you think it's necessary to be doing, you know, vocal warm-up every day? Like what do you kind of look at it as a healthy practice?
It's a really good question, and it really does differ. I kind of always bring it back to the idea of the gym. Whatever's going to be the most sustainable practice is always going to be the best, right? It's so much better to go to the gym twice a week for the rest of your life than 5 times for 2 weeks and then never again. What I do recommend to people is, if you speak a lot day to day, which is like if you're at school, you are constantly speaking to your friends, for example. I was probably speaking at school more than I do now when I coach people every day doing voice. So try to start the day with, even if it's just gentle sirens on an NG, or if it's just making sure that at the end of the day, you're doing the same thing, and maybe just gently like doing some neck rolls or doing something that feels good. In terms of safe practice, then also just making sure you're moving through the whole body. Like I mentioned earlier, that mobility stuff, that fluidity for me feels really good, what I've learned. And then if you are ever, you know, if you know you have a tendency for things to go a little bit more awry, maybe you lose your voice a lot, maybe you suffer with like tonsillitis quite a lot, things like straw phonation, where you can get a glass of water, grab a straw and blow bubbles, can be a really healthy thing to do daily, as can steaming. But other than that, you know, those are kind of warming up, cooling down, self-regulation. It really is going to come back to, for me, the best thing you should be doing daily is the awareness of the breath. And then maybe once every week, once every other week, you try to do like a half-hour voice warm-up-y thing, which you can find a load on YouTube if you search in like the National Voice Warm-Up or Barbara Hausman Voice Warm-Up. Or, you know, things will come up that you can kind of follow along and try. And if you do that like once a week, then that'll be fantastic, as well as those kind of self-regulation things throughout the week.
I love that, and it makes me feel really good, because I'm like, I'm doing this,
Yeah.
and I'm you know, naturally quite lazy and will avoid my
Well, so will I. That's the thing. I'm telling people to do stuff, and I'm like, oh, I should probably do that myself later today.
I feel like as coaches, we're often, it's like being a parent, you know, you end up looking after yourself last, and you're looking after everybody else, and then suddenly you're like, oh, I should probably do a bit of my own practice. And we're starting to come now to the end of our chat, and I'd love, if anybody that's watching us live has any questions, I'll just double check in the group. So shout out, just pop it in the comments if you have questions. But while we're waiting and just checking that, let me know, Molly, is there anything else that you wanted to share with us? Anything that's kind of on your mind, or things that have been popping up that you've noticed as patterns across the board lately? Important things.
Gosh, I think across the board, since maybe, you know, post-COVID especially, just remind yourself and give yourself grace that people are really still learning how to communicate with one another outside of acting circumstances. And just the more you can practice your communication skills as a human being, the more your acting will also flourish, and you'll understand the text and you'll understand the intentions. And I think it's, you know, I just always come back to this idea with students and clients, especially even those who, like, you might be at a stage in your lives where you're thinking, I just need to get into drama school and then it's all going to be great. Actually, for a lot of people, when they get into drama school, they suddenly feel this huge pressure to get the most out of all their sessions, and it's really overwhelming, and it's so many classes. And, you know, there's always going to be those thoughts and those doubts over, who am I? Why am I pursuing this? I have to be this. I have to, you know, do it like this in order to get it right. And just the quicker you can allow yourself to appreciate the practice, the craft of what you're doing inside and outside of the rehearsal room, the healthier, the more open you are to the work, the more honestly productive it will then become. Because just all over the shop, I get so many amazing, talented students and clients who are just constantly faced with this idea that I'm not enough, or I need to be this, and I'm failing at this. And it's just a really unhealthy habit that we all go through. But don't underestimate how putting your attention on that mindset is going to have a positive impact on your acting skills. And that's something, again, younger Molly would never have really believed, but I promise you it's totally interlinked.
Yeah, I had pretty much that discussion with a student today, where I was like, it's not the work on the monologues that's going to get you in. Actually, now you've done the work on the monologues, and what you need is a holistic approach where you're treating yourself like a professional actor, and you're doing your practice, and you're watching things that inspire you, and you're going to the theater, or you're having a chat with another artist, or you're writing something, and doing those things that fill your cup, doing the things that are about your long-term practice and not just about, I need to get this self-tape done.
Yeah.
Because I think regardless of whether it's drama school or it's audition or you know, applying to agents or wherever we're at, it's so easy to have that kind of short-term focus, and that what in the end serves us best is learning how to think long-term. And it's so long-term. I think that's something that I wish everybody knew, that it's such a journey. It takes a long time to kind of find the place where you feel comfortable, where you feel like you can, you know, regularly make work and you feel good about your own abilities and that kind of thing. It's a long journey, and the sooner you can be kind to yourself, the better. Your life will be so much better for it, and your career. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, I'll just double check. I don't think we had any questions pop up, which is totally fine, because if people are watching it in the Facebook group, they can always ask questions later. And if you're watching this on YouTube in the future, you can drop us comments and let us know what what you're facing at the moment. So for me, just because I missed recording the little introduction, in case you don't know me, I'm Sarah Gio, and you can find me on Instagram, Shakespeare with Sarah, and on YouTube, Shakespeare with Sarah. And everything I'm doing is all about not just Shakespeare, but how we can become more versatile across different forms of performance, and being happy doing stage, screen, all those kinds of things, and that our technique will support us. And Molly, why don't you tell us where we can find you?
Yes, the best place to find me is honestly Instagram, mollyp_voice coach. I'm probably the most active on there. And if you go to my link tree in the bio or description, you'll have all of my links to everything else if you're interested. So that's the place to go.
That's fabulous. And do you do one-on-one coaching as well, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, fabulous. So if people need some help, you can go to Molly, go and find out more about her, because she shares so many wonderful things on Instagram and TikTok as well. So if you're on either of those platforms, follow along. She's got so many useful things, just so accessible, which is what I'm all about. So thank you for joining us, Molly. I'm so excited to properly chat with you. Thank you so much for being here. It has been delightful.
It's been such a joy. Thank you for having me.
No worries. All right, let's sign off. Bye, everybody.